Ever felt a cold breath on your neck in the dead of night? Henry Carter thought he could outsmart the swamps of Willow Creek, hunting gators for a living, until he met Pale Fang, a 20-foot albino monster with blood-red eyes. One fateful trip into bayou shade turned deadly when his crew vanished, their camp torn apart by something massive. As Henry paddled for his life, Pale Fang lunged from the dark waters, jaws wide open. Was it just a gator or something far worse? Click now to uncover the terrifying truth. Back in the early 1930s, my grandfather, Henry Carter, used to hunt alligators in the murky swamps of Willow Creek, a small town near the Blackwater River in northern Florida. Henry, along with my 4 great-aunts and uncles, grew up in a struggling family in Willow Creek, where the river fed into a sprawling network of bayous. Times were already tough for folks in this part of the country, but when the Great Depression hit after the Wall Street crash, money became even scarcer. You could try your luck with fishing or crabbing, but with most people unable to afford such luxuries, the seafood market took a nosedive. Canned goods like sardines or clams still sold, but the canneries didn't need many workers. The same went for the timber crews. Construction jobs dried up almost completely during the Depression, and so did the demand for lumber. This left honest, hard-working folks like my grandpa with very few options to make a living. There was decent money in selling moonshine, but with prohibition still in effect until 1933, it was a dangerous game. If the law didn't catch you, a rival moonshiner might, because there was no such thing as friendly competition in that trade. But if you were desperate or bold enough, there was another way to earn a good living while putting food on the table: alligator hunting. The swamps around Willow Creek were a dense maze of cypress trees and water oaks, with narrow channels winding between small patches of dry land that locals called ridges or tree islands. There were wider stretches of open water here and there, but the gators thrived in the mosquito-filled thickets where sunlight barely reached the muddy, dark waters below. If they had enough to eat, gators could grow from 3-foot juveniles to 12-foot giants in just 5 or 6 years. The bigger they got, the more dangerous they became. Alligator trappers had to know the swamp like the back of their hand to navigate safely. Many locals made a living guiding hunters or trappers into the deepest parts of the bayou, where the oldest and largest gators lived. You had to know where they nested, where they sunned themselves, and where they'd move when the rains or tides shifted. If you got it right, you could make a fortune. A skilled group of hunters working from dawn to dusk might bring back 2, 3, or even 4 gators in a day. With high-quality gator hides selling for $3 or $4 each, a party of 5 could each take home enough money and meat to feed their families for a week. All from a single day's work. The hides weren't the only thing in demand either. If you salted the gator meat, it could last longer or be sold, while you kept the fresh cuts for yourself. Grandpa also mentioned a local herbalist near Pine Hollow who'd pay well for gator teeth and claws, claiming she used them in her healing rituals. It's easy to see why alligator hunting drew so many amateurs, especially as the economy tanked. But it was dangerous work. In the first year or so after the crash, dozens of eager but inexperienced young men ventured into the darkest corners of the swamp, hoping to make a living, only to meet a grim fate. One of the safer ways to catch a gator back then was to trap it. A trapper would bait a heavy iron hook with a chunk of meat, the more rotten, the better, and hang it over a tree branch with a rope, like fishing. Grandpa said it could be a brutally effective method when it worked, but gators were just as likely to leap out of the water and tear the meat off without getting hooked. Steel leg traps were another option, but not everyone could afford them. Instead, many inexperienced boys waded into the swamps with just a rifle or shotgun, hoping for the best. Few returned. The same could be said for groups of young men who paddled out in their small boats at night. They'd bring oil lanterns, raising them high to spot the telltale glow of a gator's eyes. It made finding them easier, but with all the splashing and blood in the water, the hunter often became the hunted. Stray into the wrong spot, and an angry gator could snap a boat in half or drag a man under to drown before his friends even noticed. A bite could be deadly too. One hunter, the lone survivor of his group, had his boat torn apart and his friends eaten by gators. He waded through the swamp all night to get back to Willow Creek. The townsfolk were devastated to lose so many, but they were relieved he'd made it home. Sadly, he didn't last a week. The swamp water had seeped into his bite wound, and he developed a severe infection. A doctor was called from Greenview, but without antibiotics, there was nothing to be done. The infection killed him in days. When they buried him, they lowered 3 empty coffins into the ground beside him, one for each of his missing friends. News of deaths in the swamps spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, but it didn't stop people from heading out to hunt gators. Things got so bad that some folks started making money by recovering the personal belongings of the missing, washed up boats, or abandoned camps. Eventually, the local sheriff had enough. He and his deputies began cracking down on anyone hunting or trapping without a license. But since licenses cost $5 and could take weeks to get, the crackdown didn't stop the desperate or the reckless. Grandpa was fortunate enough to have a license, as did a few other Willow Creek residents. Though there was sometimes fierce competition between hunting parties, most were on friendly terms. They'd meet up to drink, smoke, and swap stories at a spot they called the Rusty Anchor. It wasn't the real name of the place. Back then, a lot of illegal drinking spots were nicknamed anchors because of a running joke about paying to see a rusty anchor when you were really buying booze. The Willow Creek trappers and hunters would gather at this rusty anchor in the woods off Cedar Lane. They didn't need much encouragement to get drunk and grill gator meat, but the real value of hanging out there was the tips and tricks you'd learn from other hunters. Grandpa and his hunting buddies, Sam and Eddie, stopped by the Rusty Anchor every evening, sometimes just to hear where the best hunting spots were that week. Grandpa said he heard plenty of wild rumors at that bar, but in the summer of 1931, he heard one that topped them all. A gator hunter named Tommy Reed, who led a group of 4, was telling everyone about a recent trip into the deepest parts of Bayou Shade. They were searching for the biggest gators they could find when they spotted a massive, ghostly white gator basking on a narrow ridge. Their boats were already full from that morning's kills, so they had no room for more, but even if they had, it would have taken a lot to wrangle that monster into a boat. Tommy said the albino gator was at least 20 feet long from teeth to tail, likely weighing around 2,000 pounds of meat and hide. But as soon as they saw it, it slipped into the water and vanished. All 3 of Tommy's hunting buddies backed up his story. Grandpa might have called Tommy a liar if he'd been alone, but accusing his whole crew would have been foolish. Still, Tommy and his boys could see the skepticism on the faces of the other hunters. It didn't seem to bother them, though. They claimed their doubters would regret it once they hauled that albino beast back to town. A hide that size and in such a rare color would let them live comfortably for a week. So they set out night after night, searching for what they'd nicknamed Pale Fang. Then one morning, Tommy Reed's wife woke up to find her husband hadn't come home. It wasn't unusual for hunters to camp out overnight, especially if the tides or rains delayed them. But when the sun set and Tommy's party still hadn't returned, people started to worry. Grandpa said Tommy's wife stormed into the Rusty Anchor that night, demanding to know why the other hunters weren't out looking for her husband. The sheriff and his deputies were searching, but they didn't know the swamps half as well as Grandpa and his buddies. Tommy could be out there, injured, hiding in the wreck of his boat as hungry gators closed in, and the only ones who could help were the hunters of Willow Creek. Grandpa told me the more he thought about it, the more Mrs. Reed's words made sense. He imagined himself stuck out there, bleeding, with gators circling, praying someone from town would come looking. It didn't feel right to go back into the swamps without trying to find Tommy and his boys, even if it was just to bring back what was left of them. So, one day Grandpa met with Sam and Eddie at the Rusty Anchor and proposed a plan. They traveled deeper into the swamps than ever before to hunt gators and hopefully find Tommy Reed. They faced 2 big challenges. First, heading into the deeper swamps would require an overnight stay, and the darkness was when hunters had the most to fear. Second, they'd need 1 or 2 extra hunting parties to cover enough ground. Grandpa told Sam and Eddie to gather supplies for the long trip while he tried to recruit other hunters to join the search. But almost everyone he spoke to thought he was crazy. While they felt sorry for Tommy's wife and kids, they believed it was his own fault for going too deep into the swamp, chasing a giant white gator that might not even exist. If more hunters went out there, into places humans didn't belong, more families would end up grieving. Like a moth flying too close to a flame, Tommy had gotten burned, and it was nobody's fault but his own. Grandpa couldn't blame them for feeling that way. He even agreed to an extent. But a voice in his head kept telling him he had to do something. He told me he thought that voice might have been his conscience, though he knew how dangerous the idea was. Luckily, one other hunting party felt the same. Caleb Monroe, known as Gator to his friends, was one of the best hunters in Willow Creek. It was no secret he had a soft spot for Tommy's sister-in-law, a girl named Lila Harper. Grandpa said it took some convincing, but Caleb eventually agreed. After gathering their men and supplies, the 7-strong hunting party set off in their boats toward Bayou Shade. Grandpa said the first day was slow. They had to keep their eyes peeled for any sign of Tommy and his boys, covering a 14-mile stretch of river before reaching Bayou Shade. It was eerie out there that morning, the only sound being the hum of their boat's small engines as they glided through the water. The water was black as tar, with cypress trees jutting up through the surface, and birds calling out like lost spirits. You might spot a half-submerged log floating too still, only to realize it was a gator waiting for its next meal. It was a creepy place when it was quiet, and yet there was Grandpa, heading into the swamp's deepest, darkest depths. The 2 hunting parties arrived at Bayou Shade in the early afternoon. Since that's where Tommy claimed to have seen the albino gator, they figured it was a good place to start. They agreed to meet back up on the main body of the Blackwater River in the morning. But until then, they split up, driving their boats up and down the narrow channels, looking for any sign of Tommy, his boys, or the remains of others who'd vanished in recent months. To navigate the tighter waterways, Grandpa, Sam, and Eddie switched from their engine to oars, paddling through Bayou Shade until their arms ached. They saw plenty of gators, swamp rats, and the occasional turtle, but no sign of Tommy or his party. They searched all afternoon and into the evening. As the light faded, they started looking for a ridge dry enough to camp on. They kept paddling through the darkening channels until they had to navigate by the light of their oil lanterns and the moon. Grandpa said that kind of navigation was dangerous. The risk of wrecking your boat was much higher, and if you wrecked out there, you were in serious trouble, even if you were a strong swimmer. They paddled slowly, with Sam at the front holding a lantern to guide them through the darkness. He couldn't hold it too far out, though, unless he wanted a gator to snap at his arm. They knew they were surrounded. Dozens of gator eyes reflected the orange glow of their lanterns. Grandpa always said that was the worst part of paddling through the swamps at night, seeing everything that was watching you. After a while, they spotted lamplights in the distance. At first, they thought it might be Caleb's camp, but as they got closer, they realized someone had built a structure out there in the swamp. They paddled nearer, unsure of what to expect, and then Grandpa saw a large black cross painted against a white background. It was a small church, its rear on a ridge, its front right up against the water, and it was deathly quiet. Grandpa and his boys pulled up to the landing, calling out to see if anyone was there. A few seconds later, an old half-blind deacon emerged to greet them. When they asked if they could stay, the deacon welcomed them to sleep among the pews. They thanked him, tied up their boat, and stepped into the tiny church, finding 4 pews lit by candlelight and a rugged cross at the front. When the deacon asked what they were doing in the swamp so late, Grandpa explained their search for Tommy and their hope of bringing him home alive. The deacon said he'd pray for the man's safe return, but when Grandpa mentioned the giant white gator Tommy had claimed to see, the deacon's expression turned cold. He said he'd seen Pale Fang himself up close, and it was the biggest gator he'd ever laid eyes on. He'd been out in his boat sharing kind words with some swamp folk near Mossy Bend when something huge and pale slipped out of the undergrowth behind him and into the water. He said there was no way a creature that size could hide, and the massive splash it made had him clutching the cross around his neck. He paddled like mad to get away, but every time he looked back, the bubbles on the surface got closer. He knew a gator had taken a deadly interest in him, and if it snapped his boat in half, he'd have to swim for his life to reach solid ground. But as the thing closed in, he started reciting, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, and he leadeth me beside still waters." The deacon said the moment the words "still waters" left his lips, the bubbles stopped. He kept paddling, but the white gator submerged and left him alone. Grandpa said Eddie told the deacon, with all due respect, that it would take more than prayers to bring down a beast that size. The deacon's face turned pale again. He lowered his voice and told them to listen carefully. He said the devil moved through the swamp, in the beasts and birds, just as he did through people. He didn't know where Pale Fang was or what it truly was, but it had a better chance of dragging them all to hell than they did of dragging it out of the swamp. His words weren't meant to be harsh, just a warning. A gator that size wouldn't go down easily, and Grandpa was risking his life just being in its territory. But they hadn't come all that way to turn back, not when they were so close to the heart of the swamp. At dawn, once there was enough light, Grandpa and his buddies climbed back into their boat and headed deeper into the bayou. They were paddling slowly, eating stale bread and molasses for breakfast, when they heard a sound that chilled their blood. 1 minute, there was nothing but the hum of insects and frogs. And then out of nowhere, a distant gunshot echoed through the swamp. It was a single large caliber shot, the kind you'd hear when a trapped gator was dispatched with a rifle. But then they heard 4 or 5 more pops, smaller and more frantic, like something had gone wrong. Grandpa and his buddies paddled toward the gunshots as fast as they could. Soon they started seeing massive gators floating in the waters around their boat. Unlike the smaller ones in the outer swamps, these fully grown gators didn't bother moving out of the way. Rather than risk angering them by bumping them, Grandpa and his crew slowed down, their jaws dropping at the sheer size of some of these beasts. There were real monsters out there, the kind they'd usually stop to hunt before retreating, but this time they kept paddling, trying not to disturb them as they ventured deeper into the swamp. They paddled for about an hour, growing more nervous with each stroke. If they strayed into a gator spawning ground, an overprotective mother could cause serious trouble. They moved slowly, keeping their eyes peeled and mouths shut. Then as they rounded a wall of cypress trees, they spotted something that turned their stomachs. Through a jagged clearing on the bank, they saw a campsite littered with the blood-splattered remains of Caleb Monroe's hunting party. Grandpa said it was one of the most horrific sights he'd ever seen. Guns and gear were scattered everywhere. An empty boat still floated in the shadows, and half-eaten bodies lay among the grass, with flies buzzing over the carnage. Limbs were missing, bodies were torn open, and one man's boot sat upright, still laced, as if it had been yanked clean off. It wasn't the kind of mess a knife or gunshots could leave behind. If a gator had done this, it must have been enormous and incredibly fast. After seeing the bodies, Grandpa and his boys considered turning back. If Caleb and his crew, more experienced hunters who traveled in larger numbers, couldn't survive whatever attacked them, what chance did they have? On the journey back, the weight of the loss hung over them. They felt ashamed and defeated, but if they didn't return home, who would provide for their families? Eddie was up front, paddling steadily, when he pointed out a huge gator, easily 12 feet long, basking on a ridge. Eddie thought it might be the gator that killed Caleb and his crew. Sam was skeptical, saying any gator that size or bigger could have done it. Grandpa was halfway through agreeing when the murky waters in front of the 12-foot gator exploded. Out of nowhere, the monstrous 20-foot albino gator surged up from the depths, pale as a ghost, its reddish-pink eyes flashing as its jaws clamped down on the smaller gator's head with a sickening crunch. The smaller gator thrashed wildly, whipping its tail and flailing its limbs, but it was no match for the giant beast that had taken it by surprise. The albino gator dragged it back into the swamp in a swirl of foam and blood, then submerged and swam off. Eddie's jaw dropped. Sam froze mid-stroke, and Grandpa stood still as a statue, staring at the ripples left in its wake. There were a few moments of stunned silence as the boat rocked gently, but then the water down the channel started to churn. A huge blur of silt and pale hide sliced through the swamp, coming at them so fast they barely had time to react. Grandpa paddled like mad while Eddie fumbled with a shotgun, slamming shells into the breach. Grandpa turned just as the beast erupted from the water, its ghostly hide streaming with water, teeth bared for the kill. Pale fangs surged upward, jaws gaping like a grave. Eddie fired twice, the blasts echoing across the swamp as shotgun pellets tore into the albino's snout. Bright red blood streaked its scales, but the shots only dazed it, and it sank beneath the surface with a hiss. The boat lurched forward as the beast splashed down, and for a moment, Grandpa thought they might be safe. But seconds later, he heard the same thrashing sound behind them as Pale Fang prepared to charge again. Grandpa's arms burned as the water exploded once more, but he and Sam rowed harder, willing each other to push on. At the rear, Eddie held the shotgun with trembling hands and began praying aloud. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness. And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me." Grandpa said Eddie's final words were drowned out by another explosion of water. The albino beast lunged, jaws snapping inches from the boat's edge. But Eddie's timing was perfect. He fired 2 more shots, the pellets ripping through Pale Fang's flesh, causing dark red blood to gush into the foam. The beast thrashed, letting out a guttural bellow, then slumped, wounded and broken, before slinking back into the depths. Eddie rushed to reload as Grandpa and Sam kept paddling, but the swamp soon fell silent again, save for the creak of the boat, the splash of the oars and their ragged breaths. They reached the next bayou, which would take them home. Grandpa said Eddie sat up front, shotgun still across his lap, with a look of exhaustion and guilt on his face. That expression captured the mood. No bodies recovered, no closure to bring home, and they'd been lucky to escape with their lives. The sense of defeat made the journey back feel endless. They spoke little, their silence heavier than words, dreading the shame of returning empty-handed to families hoping for miracles. The sun was setting by the time they reached the dock near Willow Creek. Grandpa and his buddies climbed out, legs unsteady, and left their boat tied up as they walked into town. First came the reunion with their families. Sam's mother threw her arms around him, not caring that he smelled of sweat and swamp rot, while Eddie's little brother clung to his leg, his father thanking the heavens for their safe return. Grandpa's mother told him how proud she was. It didn't matter that they'd returned empty-handed. They'd tried, and that's what counted. Then came the hard part, delivering the bad news to the families of Caleb Monroe and his boys. Caleb's mother collapsed with a wail when Grandpa told her son wasn't coming home, and she would have fallen if Caleb's sisters hadn't caught her. The same went for the families of his hunting party. They'd gone out to rescue Tommy and spare his kin the pain of loss, but in a cruel twist, they too were now grieving. To Grandpa, it felt like a sick joke, and he couldn't help but feel like he was the punchline. Why had he survived when so many hadn't? How could he live with himself, knowing he'd turn back at the first sign of real danger? He struggled with those thoughts for a long time, until Tommy Reed's funeral, when Tommy's widow told Grandpa how much she appreciated his efforts to find her husband. That helped ease some of the guilt, but not all of it. Grandpa gave up gator hunting for good after that encounter with Pale Fang. He traded the swamp for a small farm, where he caught the eye of Lila Harper, the girl Caleb had been sweet on. After a long courtship, they married under the cypress trees in the spring of 1941. Sadly, the draft took Grandpa in 1942, and after serving in the war, he returned to Willow Creek. Started a family, and years later would sit us by the fire, telling this exact story in a low voice. He'd swear to us kids that no battle ever chilled his blood like the day he and his boys stared into the crimson glare of that monstrous albino alligator that nearly dragged them all to hell.